The death of Osama bin Laden. This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. It started with the news of the death of Osama bin Laden. Then we learned how he died at the hands of U.S. Special Forces by order of the president. It was and will always be an extraordinary, high-stakes raid staged by Americans who were willing to die for the cause. But starting today, some of the details started to change. Some aspects of the storyline involving bin Laden's wife, bin Laden himself, and a lot of people are waiting for a very big piece of evidence, a post-mortem photograph of bin Laden. In a moment, you will hear the CIA director confirm to us a photo will ultimately be released, potentially the most widely viewed photograph in the world. But the question is when? So again, tonight we have comprehensive coverage of this story, starting with our chief White House correspondent, Chuck Todd. And Chuck, there seems to be a little tug, a little disagreement between branches of the Obama government over whether or not or when to release this photo.
Well, Brian, let's make this clear. This is the president's decision. This is a White House decision. This is not the decision that should be made by Leon Panetta, and that's what folks here tell me. And that's why that decision hasn't been made. And in fact, many senior aides here are arguing against ultimately ever releasing a photo. It's one of many questions facing the White House today. Proof of death. One reason President Obama chose the risky Navy SEALs operation rather than bombing the compound was to make sure there would be evidence to prove the U.S. got Osama bin Laden. And now they have it. DNA, photos, even videos. All of bin Laden dead at the compound and on the aircraft carrier that was used for his burial at sea. But so far, senior aides to the president do not see much need to release the photographic evidence.
I'll be candid that there are sensitivities here in terms of the appropriateness of releasing photographs of Osama bin Laden and in the aftermath of this firefight, and we're making an evaluation about the need to do that.
It was a sentiment echoed by some on Capitol Hill today.
I just don't see a need to do it. The DNA has been dispositive.
I personally think it's morbid.
Others think the White House needs to provide the proof.
Let's not have conspiracy theories develop. From what I've heard of the pictures, they're not ghoulish.
Meanwhile, some details of the government's official story have changed, raising some eyebrows. Yesterday, John Brennan implied bin Laden participated in the firefight.
The concern was that bin Laden would oppose any type of capture operation. Indeed, he did. It was a firefight. He therefore was killed in that firefight, and that's when the remains were removed.
Brennan also said bin Laden used his wife as a human shield.
She served as a shield. Again, this is my understanding, and we're still getting the reports of exactly what happened at particular moments. Today,
Press Secretary Jay Carney read an updated version of events provided by the Department of Defense.
In the room with bin Laden, a woman, bin Laden's wife, rushed the U.S. assaulter and was shot in the leg but not killed. Bin Laden was then shot and killed. He was not armed.
So, Brian, the reason for the change right now, all of those Navy SEALs that participated in this fight are doing after-action debriefings at a base in Afghanistan. And as they get more information, the story does change. And as somebody at the White House said to me, this is something that happens regularly under military operations, the fog of war.
All right, Chuck Todd from the White House starting us off on what, as you heard, is still a movable situation.
In the wake of the death of Osama bin Laden, the question now is what will it take to truly defeat al-Qaeda? And joining me now is Representative Peter King, Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. Congressman, thank you for joining me.
Thank you,
Before we get to that big question, tell me what your view is about the pictures of a dead bin Laden. Would you release them?
You know, this is not a major issue with me, but I've spoken to people who have seen the pictures, and I think it is important to get out the picture of his face. My understanding is that it does not look ghoulish or it's not going to terrify people. And like you mentioned the conspiracy theorists. I think one way to head that off, or at least to minimize it, would be to put the picture out so it doesn't look as if we're hiding anything. Again, if it was something that were particularly brutal to look at, I would say no, it might be offensive. But from what I've heard from people who've seen it, I think it's probably the right thing to do to release it. But, that's up to the administration. I'm not going to make a major issue with them on it. But again, from what I know, I would say yes.
I mean, I don't really understand the difference, to be honest with you, in terms of potential propaganda use between killing bin Laden and releasing a picture of him dead. I mean, it's the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. Again, if we're horribly distorted or, something really brutal, I can see why people may find it offensive. It can stir up emotions. But to me, it should be out there, and it would, again, cut off the conspiracy theorists and at least minimize it, but there's no doubt he is dead. We killed him. We should be proud of it.
Obviously, with bin Laden gone, the question now is what is left of al-Qaeda? And the general view seems to be it still exists. It's quite an amorphous kind of organisation. No one's quite sure where its head now is. But it's still dangerous. It's still out there. It's still active. One of the big issues that's come out of this is the suggestion that let's call it torture, and we can come to the distinction in a minute, of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in Guantanamo Bay may have led to information which led to the identification of bin Laden's courier and therefore bin Laden. Do you believe that that is what happened? And do you believe, if that's the case, that vindicates the use of interrogation methods like waterboarding?
Let me say, first of all, I don't consider it torture. We can have that as a separate debate. I consider it enhanced interrogation. No, but from my understanding, speaking to people who were very much involved, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded, obviously. Not in Guantanamo, this didn't happen. It happened in Europe, at a site in Europe. He was waterboarded, and after the waterboarding was finished, he did give us information on the courier. That's the first significant information we had on the courier, which ultimately led to the shooting and the killing of bin Laden. And not just Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but also al-Libi. He was also subject to very intense interrogation in Europe, I believe in 2005, and he also gave us information. So I think it's fair to say that it was a long road to getting bin Laden, but the first major steps on that road resulted from the interrogation, very intense interrogation of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and al-Libi. I do support it, and I'm only speaking for myself now when I say this, but I think it was the moral thing to do. I'm not defending it. I'm actually being very emphatic, being very proactive in supporting it. I use the example, Piers, if on September 10th, 2001, we had captured Mohammed Atta, one of the other 19 conspirators, and we knew that somewhere, in the next several days, 3,000 Americans were going to be murdered. I say it's the moral thing to do. If we had to hold his head underwater to save those 3,000 people, do it. And I went to so many wakes and funerals after September 11th. I would never want to go to a wake or funeral and tell a mother or father, a brother or sister of someone who was burned to death, who had to jump 96 stories to their death, and say, we could have saved your son or daughter, but I didn't want to hold Mohammed Atta's head underwater.
The problem is that that argument is perfectly valid, and people will agree with you, I'm sure, in large numbers. But what happens if American servicemen are captured? Say these Navy SEALs have been captured. Would you have been perfectly happy for them to be waterboarded and put through all the other things that you think are perfectly acceptable for the people at, say, Guantanamo Bay?
There's two things. One, Navy SEALs are waterboarded as part of their training. They go through it as part of their training. Secondly, al-Qaeda is going to torture and kill our prisoners no matter what we do. And again, if you're respecting the Geneva Conventions and we're talking about POWs, that's one thing. But if you're talking about non-uniformed terrorists, then I think a different set of rules do apply. And again, I don't consider it torture. Again, it's done to our own Navy SEALs as part of their training.
How effective, though, is this information when, when we talked about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he was waterboarded 183 times, and apparently the information he gave about the courier was actually false. So how effective is it?
No, I've spoken to people on the ground, people who are involved in that, and that was the first significant information they got was from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and from al-Libi. That's what started the process going, which with much more information obviously gained later on, part of a very long process, Osama bin Laden was killed. But we would not have gotten there, I don't believe, if we had not gotten the initial information from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I also have spoken to a number of people who are very familiar with the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed situation. We did get a large amount of information from him that was very useful.
Well, it's a very contentious issue.
Sure.
Congressman, thank you for joining me and sparking the debate. When we come